Community Forest Management Plan, Matt Wybell, Save a Tree.
Good evening. I am not Matt, but I have a presentation. So, poor Matt.
You know, you're the first that's going to try out this technology.
We're gonna give it a shot.
You got it covered. You got it covered.
I thought we had something last week, didn't we?
No.
We didn't have time last week. Never mind. We certainly didn't have anything last week.
Is that there?
You
Great.
just had Rob's picture.
Well, good evening. My name's Steve Robbins. I'm the consulting town engineer, and I have the privilege of introducing this evening Matt Wybell from Save a Tree. Matt is here to talk about the community forest management plan that the town has developed through Save a Tree. The town secured a grant from the DEC to develop this plan. Matt's going to walk through the work that he has done. He has been a great resource for the town, and we've had several meetings and training sessions with local highway and park staff on what this plan is and how to implement it. I do want to give credit to Michelle Higgins at the DEC and George Profos, also at the DEC, who's forester there, for their work with the town, helping work with us through the grant process and providing technical assistance to the town. So special recognition to the DEC, and we appreciate the state's partnership and working with municipalities and providing grants for important projects like this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you. As you said, my name is Matt Wybell. I'm a ISA certified arborist, tree risk assessment qualified arborist through the ISA, a registered consulting arborist through the American Society of Consulting Arborists. Button right pressed. Hold on. Okay, that's fine. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the assignment, what I did for the inventory, results of the inventory, program called iTree Echo, results of that, and then some of my recommendations is kind of briefly from what I found. So the assignment was to inventory trees within the right of way and available planting spaces in the right of way of select municipal roads. A priority road list was developed by, I guess, DPW. In addition, we did trees in 4 parks: Bailey Park, Van Tassel Park, Reese and Upper Reese Park, Angle Flat Preserve. And those areas include all the trees in the maintained areas, and then do what's called level 1 assessment of trees along borders and trails. And as Steve mentioned, this is funded by the DEC, grant from DEC.
Matt, when you say it's an inventory, is that literally the counting of it on different species, or I guess you're going to tell us how exactly the risk factor I see up there?
Yeah. So, so what I did is I walked every street that was listed as a priority street. I walked every one of those, and every tree was in the right of way. I collected the species, common and Latin name for every tree, measured diameter at breast height, 4.5 feet above grade. It's a standard measurement point. Did an ISA risk assessment for each tree, noted its condition, excellent, good, fair, poor, or dead. Made notes of specific defects, large deadwood, dieback, decay, whatever I might find. Made recommendations to mitigate those risks, assigned a priority level to those recommendations, and then did something called a residual risk, which is the tree's currently elevated risk, and we're do the prune the deadwood, saw cable. Whenever we recommended the tree, what will the risk then be? We get it from a high to a low, high to a moderate. How does that work? I collect the location, so GPS location as well as address for trees. I also included available planting spaces that I found along these roads. So for those, I collected the type of, it was a strip, a lawn strip, an open lawn area, a tree pit, tree well. How big, how wide was that strip if it's a strip? Are there overhead wires, yes or no? I recommended a tree size based on those factors of large, medium, or small. And same thing, got location, address, and GPS. So overall, there were 3,646 trees in the roads I did, and this slide is a typo, so I apologize. I found 135 available planting spaces in those roads as well. So you can kind of see the area that there's some gaps there of roads that weren't included. We didn't have enough budget to do every single road in town.
Should that say town of Silver?
It should have, yes, that's a typo, yes. So here's Reese and Upper Reese Park. So I was talking about before in parks, trees in the maintained areas were all included. So you can see around the ball fields, around the buildings, a row by the tennis courts there. But then I also walked along the perimeter of private property. You can see on the right side down to the lower right corner, there's a few trails that run through those wooded areas there. Because obviously doing every tree within the woods would be a waste of time. If a tree falls in the woods, no one's there to get hit. It doesn't really matter. So we focused on places to actually have a target, that would be useful for the town to know to manage those trees.
Can I just ask you one question? Just look at the numbers there. They're not in sequence like along the side of the tennis courts at Reese. I was just wondering if there's a reason what that means. Because 4, 3, 6, 2, 4, 3, 5, 8.
Yeah, it's because it's so zoomed out that there's like 30 or 40 trees in that row, but you can't see every number.
Oh, I get you. Okay. All right.
So I should have made the numbers appear when it gets closer in this, but
okay, thanks.
yeah, no problem. All right, so briefly go over some of the results here. So as I mentioned, as part of the inventory, I collected diameter for each tree in the inventory. So diameter is kind of used as a proxy for age. What you want in a population is more trees in the younger or middle-aged class to replace the older. Obviously a tree that's older and larger is more likely to die in the short term than a younger tree. So we want to have more younger trees to kind of replace the older ones as they go. So this is actually a fairly good distribution where we're peaking in the 8 to 10 range, and again in the 16, 18 range. So that's pretty good distribution wise, what we want to see. In terms of the species diversity, 97 different species were included in the inventory. Sugar maple is by far the most common, made up almost 20% of the population. That's a fairly significant number. We generally prefer not to have more than 10% of any one species. And that's because when certain pest issues come in, it can wipe out entire. So for example, like in the 1950s, American elm was a dominant, roadside tree, street tree in America. Dutch elm disease came in and killed the vast majority of the elm trees. So they all had to be replaced. And then a lot of people ended up replacing those with ash trees because they had a similar kind of shape. And now we have old ash borer killing most of our ash trees. So you want to try to avoid that kind of homogeneity and get more diversity in there. So if the next pest does come in that maybe kills sugar maples, that would be pretty devastating. 90% of your population, your tree canopy goes. So you want to keep that diversity a little better than this, basically. And then 7 species were invasive. Overall, 50% of the population were invasive species. Norway maple, the most common one of those, because they, until fairly recently, were planted pretty commonly as a road tree because they tolerate urban environments, but they do escape cultivation and kind of get into the native lands and displace native species. But mentioned also did a risk assessment for every tree, and the ISA has a protocol for doing that. And so if you look at the top matrix there, you see likelihood of tree or tree part failure on the left side along the top, likelihood of impacting a target. So, when I do the assessment, look for an issue I'm concerned about. So it could be larger with the canopy, it could be decay at the base or whatever it is. Look at the likelihood if the tree were to fail at that part, what target would it hit? If it falls into a woods where no one is, that's okay. If it falls over a parking lot where cars are constantly parked there, that's a high target. So you look at those two things, get overall, and you get a likelihood of failure and impact. You use the one below, the matrix below there, look at the consequence of that failure. So obviously if a 20-inch tree were to fall on a car or a house, that's more significant than if a 5-inch tree were to fall. So you might have a significant or severe consequence for a 20-inch tree, but a negligible if it's a 5-inch tree. So that gives you an overall risk rating for the tree. So this, you can see 95% were low risk and then only 5 were high risk, which shows that the town's doing a pretty good job of identifying those high risk trees. Those are mostly dead or dying trees or obvious decay defects that are in high use areas. So the town's doing a pretty good job, or had been doing a pretty good job already of maintaining those trees before they got too bad, which is positive. So I did the planting space inventory, as I said, 135 planting spaces. I didn't consider any strip of lawn that was less than 5 feet wide. I didn't consider for use. And that's because even at 5 feet wide, a small tree can still start lifting sidewalks to be an issue. So I prefer not to use those. Small trees that mature size under 30 feet will recommend if there's overstory wires or other utilities that might be in the way. a medium-sized tree. If there's some other issues, any space isn't that large, or there's other issues running farther overhead, and then large trees recommended spots where there's no canopy restriction and no root zone restrictions. And there are 118 the locations were for large trees. So as I mentioned, after I did the inventory, I ran this through a program called iTree Echo. It's suite of tools developed by U.S. Forest Service, based on peer-reviewed science that looks at the environmental, ecological benefits of trees within an inventory within a population. So in this case, it estimates the amount of pollution removal on an annual basis, total carbon storage within the trees, annual sequestration of carbon, oxygen produced, and things like that. So based on the iTree results, the trees within the inventory remove approximately 2,059 pounds of pollution per year. They currently store 2,990 tons of carbon and sequester annually an extra 33 more tons per year, produce almost 89 tons a year of oxygen. And the canopies of those trees basically prevent runoff of additional 92,000 cubic feet of water, stormwater annually. So obviously if the trees weren't there, there'd be a lot of overburden for sewer systems and waterways and things of that nature.
How does the math work on this? Sorry, pollution removal, 2,000 pounds per year equates to $2,400. How?
Yeah, so the dollars they seek, the program seeks to put an
Is it a
estimate
ratio?
yeah, basically,
Okay.
basically. I'm not sure what
There's an
that's peer
economic
reviewed. I don't know what the research
benefit
comes
calculated
from, but yeah, they estimate that
Okay,
it
thanks.
saves that much per year, and I guess health benefits and things of that
But
nature.
I mean, just relatively speaking, I mean, what does that mean to me? I mean, is that big,
Right.
a lot or a little or?
Right. Yeah, but the other part is only the trees we inventory, obviously. So
I'm sorry?
it's also only the trees that were actually in the inventory. So if you think of all the trees in the woodlands throughout those parks and roads that we didn't do, we probably did 5-10% of the trees within the town.
Just gross that up.
So it'd be significantly more, obviously, if we include all the forested trees in the assessment. So I guess the way to look at it is, if we were to remove, that many trees, if you were to clear cut a large area and removing trees, this is how much oxygen we're losing in a year and how much carbon carbon that's now in the atmosphere that wouldn't be sequestered by the trees.
You mean like remove trees for housing or stuff like that?
Right, things like that. So this program is used sometimes. I don't know if you care about this at all, but for certain places, I think in like California, where they're doing a land clearing or a development process,
Control.
because they require some tree replacement. And the one way to calculate that is, we'll see how do we replace the environmental benefits the trees are removing. So removing 10, 30-inch trees, you run through iTree, and these trees sequester this much carbon, this much oxygen. How many 3-inch, 4-inch trees you have to plant now to replace that ecological benefit over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years? So that's one way some towns are kind of, because a lot of places have like a 1-to-1 tree ratio, but a 3-inch tree doesn't really do the same as a 30-inch tree. And it's going to take 50, 60, 80 years to get to that same spot. So how do we think about how to equivalize that? And that's one way some people have sought to do that. But that's a lot of time.
Here in a moment.
So I made recommendations for all the trees, or that needed it, I should say. 2,200 trees I didn't make any recommendations for. Remove approximately 100 trees, treat tree. So it could be anything from pruning and sawing a cable, any kind of action to the tree, about 600. Treat site, that could be like, let's say there's a bench under a tree. So it's a high, if we move that bench and the tree fails, it lowers the occupancy of the site. So maybe that reduces the risk of the site. It's a mature tree that we don't want to remove. So that's an option. As I said, I assigned priority levels for those recommendations. So there's only 3 immediates. There are 3 ash trees that were still in fairly good health that I thought could be treated for emerald ash borer and preserved if we wanted to. Then you can see, I see the breakdown between high, medium, and low recommendations. So I used general pricing and create a 5-year plan, how much it would cost to do all these recommendations over a 5-year period. and it was
A lot.
1.2 million. And some of this work's already been done. I did the inventory, I forgot to mention that in the beginning. Late 2021 was when the inventory was done. So some of this has already been performed in the last year. So going forward, obviously use the inventory to work on the higher priority recommendations first and move through as budget allows. Something that, you know, the DEC really recommends, and it's a great idea. So if you can have people on staff in town who are ISA certified or risk assessment qualified, help do like post-storm assessments or even annual assessments of trees in high use areas, to know if there's a better idea of what trees need action or don't need action. So that would be useful. And then someone also knows, you know, is good at young tree pruning. If you prune a tree, you know, pruning a 3-4 inch tree, you can, few pruning cuts, relatively cost effective and cheap. You can fix things like codominant stems and structural issues when they're young. The tree will live longer and have less maintenance needs in the future. So if you can start having someone who's trained and knows how to do that, you can do a lot of trees in a day and, like I said, reduce your future maintenance costs that way. And as I mentioned previously, 20% of the population was sugar maples. Overall, almost 35% was within the maple genus. So red maple, sugar maple, Norway maple. So these are pretty high percent of the population. So I'd recommend trying to avoid maples in general for your street tree plantings going forward and trying to improve your diversity a little bit. So some of the underutilized species, things like bur oak or hackberry, Kentucky coffee tree, hickory trees, American lindens. But there's a bunch more in the report. And
But say that again, just, will be that, what, I mean, no, just, what are the tree, you don't want maples, but you would want to direct to what species?
So right now, I said maple trees are about 35% of the population within the tree inventory. So we want to plant, so based on the results of the inventory, things like bur oak, type of oak tree, swamp white oak, hackberry.
I think my wife would love it, but
Linden.
I did a Kentucky coffee tree in my garden.
Yeah, it sounds great. Yeah, it's great. The coffee from those aren't as good as real coffee. So
You want around.
you can do it though. So the point is, yeah, there's a lot of native, these are all native trees too. You know, I want to focus on native trees that are adapted to the environment here. You don't have to worry about becoming invasive or skipping cultivation. So there's a few species that are relatively easy to find in nursery stock, and that are not that overly used yet in your town, that would help create that more diversity. So hopefully the next pest that comes in doesn't impact maple trees, because, you know, if the next tree is an maple borer that's very damaging maple trees, you're going to have a pretty big problem, I guess, considering you're going to lose 34% of your trees or treat them or whatever you have to do, depending on what the pest is. So we want to try to avoid, you know, that kind of thing going forward. So that's the quick summary.
So Steve, if I can ask you, so the grant that we got, it was from the DEC, you said? That was to conduct this survey. Now we have to decide what, if anything, we want to do with this information, right?
Yes. So Highway and Parks, you know, have been working with Matt, and they've been great partners in this process as well. Obviously, town resources to address every need is limited, but having this kind of inventory does allow the town to apply for other DEC grants for, you know, more tree maintenance and other resources. So this was kind of the first step in being able to access some of those other funding sources, and, you know, get additional training and support to town staff. The dollar numbers in a couple of slides previously, you know, assume that an outside service is doing all of that tree work and not in-house. So there's some significant savings that can occur especially with the smaller trees where town staff is very capable of.
Now, the town of Bedford,
In some cases where it's appropriate.
the town of Bedford has a program like this with another busy bee. I think it's 2 days a week they go in there. Is that a similar thing where they're taking care of trees in the town right of way that have safety issues, or I guess safety is the main thing, right?
Well, and to the town's credit and the utilities credit, there's been a lot of tree work done over the years in town right of ways as well. So, you know, I don't know if you can speak to Bedford, but I'm not familiar exactly with what they're doing, but it
There's not wires.
sounds
Okay.
like a similar structure.
But, and so you mentioned about electrical wires and NYSEG's plan. I was going to ask about that. Is this in any way combined with that, or this is just safety? We're not talking about the impact on wires. And my second question, maybe you want to answer, is you talk about invasive species of trees. And we know that there are tremendous numbers of invasive species of vines and mile a minute, whatever, we had the whole thing here, bamboo, but especially the vines. You notice that a lot of trees, which of course makes them unsafe because eventually you can kill them. Is that part of this too? And so I guess, is there any part of NYSEG, you work with NYSEG to keep the lights on, and then also the invasive vines and other things like that that affect trees? Is there any mitigation program for those things?
I didn't work directly with the power company, but I consider the power lines as a target when going through the risk assessment process. So obviously, if a tree were to fall, take out wires, that'd be a pretty significant issue with blackout for.
So the consideration.
But yeah, it's consideration
Right.
looking at the risk assessment portion as a target. In terms of the vines, the tree in the inventory had vines on it that were pretty invasive and hanging on the canopy, and because as you quickly mentioned, it had extra weight, so it can cause limbs to break. They can take over the canopy and shade trees out and kill them. So if vines were noticed on them, I recommend the cutting or removing the vines, but there wasn't a specific inventory to identify trees with vines per se. But
it does take into account that, I guess that's my question, that you would eliminate or cut down the invasive vines in order to save the tree and not wait until they kill the tree and then we lose a tree and then we have more expense.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely recommendation made sometimes is just to cut or remove the vines as best as possible. Yeah.
But that wasn't a prerequisite in terms of when you did your study, though.
No. I mean, I was just doing that, like I said, the right of ways along the roads, and within the parks. If it was a tree that was near a trail or a target that had vines, and it was an issue, it would be in the inventory. But
Let me just add, is this an operational plan as well? I mean, in other words, can you operationalize this plan from what has been done so far?
Yeah, that's been a lot of the discussion with Parks and Highway is, within their resources, how do they incorporate this into their workflow and where do they focus their efforts?
But the plan is in such a state that they can adjust their work. No, it's a matter of getting them into their workflow. They know what they have to do. It's specific enough to
Yes.
operationalize. I don't know how to say that any better. I mean,
And even to the degree during our last meeting, there was discussion about how to integrate some of the GIS resources that have been developed with this inventory to within the work order management system that Highway and other departments in the town currently utilize. So, yes.
so, and the trees that you looked at, could you look at it as a sample? In other words, you have a recommendation for this tree, but that may mean that around this tree, you have those similar problems. And when the operational guys go there, they look at it and they kind of make some judgments about what's going on around.
yeah, yes, looked at every tree, obviously, but yeah, sometimes there are like a row of ash trees that are all the same condition, have the same priority rating. But yeah, in some cases, there might be a thing where this tree is a high priority, but the one next to it's medium priority, but it might be cheaper since you already have a crew there to work on both at the same time. So that's something you can consider.
All right.
But yeah, the inventory wasn't done by sampling per se in the sense, I mean, it with every tree.
Okay.
There.
And Rich, what I was going to say before was just keep in mind when NYSEG does it, it only does it around, 10, 15 around its wires.
Right.
So, and anything outside of that, they're not going to touch.
Because a couple of years ago, Tom, and I guess everybody was on the board then, we set aside some money
Yes.
for work on trees before they became a problem and affect the electrical wires. I don't think it. Remember, we waited one day for like somebody's going to come in with a proposal that never came.
It never came in. The biggest problem is people hate the trees when you lose your power, but when you go to cut it down on a blue sky day, everybody does don't touch my tree.
Yeah.
But we've had NYSEG has had an aggressive program, as Rob knows, doing quite a bit of tree trimming recently. And correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, in order to trim wires or trim trees around wires, normally you have to have a special license or carry a special insurance as well.
Right, yeah, to do within a certain,
Yeah.
if it was 10 feet or whatever it is, yes.
All right, thanks.
That's great. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks for your time.